Early November is usually the easiest part of my travel season. I'm 44, and I work as a regional insurance claims auditor reviewing storm damage reports across central Indiana, which means most of my days are spent driving county roads and most of my nights are spent at small desks in forgettable motel rooms, comparing contractor estimates against policy language. I prefer older roadside places a little outside town, where the rates drop after summer and the parking lots stay quiet. One evening I checked into a long, single-story motel along State Route 41 outside Terre Haute, took room 214, second from the end, and settled into what felt like another ordinary stop along a familiar route. Cold air moved through the open walkway, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves. If you subscribe for more realistic horror accounts like this, you'll understand why this one stayed with me. I had booked 2 nights because I needed uninterrupted time to finish several complicated hail damage files before sending my report to headquarters. The motel clerk mentioned they were between seasonal construction crews, so the property was quieter than usual, which suited me. By 9:30 I had my routine in place. Laptop open on the small desk, television on mute for light, paperwork spread across the bed in neat stacks. I worked steadily for about an hour, then around 10:30 p.m. I stepped outside for a short walk along the corridor to clear my head. Beyond the dark line of trees past the lot, I could hear muted highway noise, softened by distance. Above the ice machine alcove, a fluorescent light flickered with a tired, irregular pulse. On my way back toward 214, I noticed the door of room 218 standing slightly open. The gap was narrow, maybe 3 inches, just enough to show a dim slice of interior light. A television was on inside, but the volume was so low it barely registered as sound, more like static than programming. The place had seemed mostly vacant, but I assumed someone had checked in late and let the door drift open without realizing it. 15 minutes later, I walked back out to buy a soda from the vending machine. The low hum of the compressor vibrated through the concrete beneath my shoes. The door to 218 was still open at exactly the same angle. I went back to work and, over the next 2 hours, stepped outside several times to stretch and rest my eyes. Every time, room 218 looked unchanged. The television glow remained steady. No shadow crossed the doorway. No voice, no footsteps, no water running. Nothing you usually hear when someone is actually occupying a motel room. Just after midnight, I happened to look up from the paperwork and saw a vehicle enter the lot slowly from the road. Its headlights stayed off until the turn was complete, then came on briefly before the driver parked near the far end of the building. I waited a little, expecting a door slam or the sound of someone walking the corridor, but none came. A while later I glanced outside again. The car was gone. The door to 218 remained open by the same exact 3 inches, as if measured. Cold wind rattled the loose aluminum railing along the walkway. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, leave a like. A little after 1, I stepped outside again and immediately felt that something had changed. It took me a second to identify it. The television inside 218 was no longer on. The doorway was still open the same distance, but the faint electronic glow was gone, and with it the soft static I had gotten used to hearing without noticing. The corridor felt strangely flat after that, as though some background layer had been removed. Wind moved through the bare branches beyond the lot, but otherwise there was no sound at all. I checked my phone out of habit. It read 1:07 a.m. I remember standing there longer than necessary, looking at that narrow gap and feeling an unexpected reluctance to walk past it. Eventually I decided to get ice for the small cooler I kept in the room. The machine was only a few doors down, but reaching it meant passing 218. I remember thinking that avoiding the room entirely would be childish, and that the simplest explanation was still the most likely one. So I started walking. As I got closer, I noticed the position of the door more clearly. It was angled in a way that blocked most of the room from view. From where I stood, I could see only darkness and the edge of a wall. The television was fully off. The room looked empty, but not naturally empty. More like visibility had been deliberately limited. I kept walking, and just as I came even with the doorway, the door shifted inward a fraction. Not a swing, not the movement of air. A controlled adjustment, slight but unmistakable, as if someone behind it had changed their grip. I stopped immediately, though I didn't turn my head toward the opening. I just stood there facing forward, every part of my attention fixed on that space beside me. For several seconds nothing happened. Then nothing continued happening long enough to feel deliberate. I had the distinct impression that someone was standing just behind the door, close enough to hear me breathing, waiting for me to take one more step toward the ice machine 6 feet beyond the opening. I didn't run. I didn't say anything. I turned casually, as if I had simply forgotten something in my room, and walked back the way I had come. I let myself into 214, locked the door, and looked through the curtain. A few seconds later, for the first time all night, the door to 218 moved. It closed slowly and completely. I could hear only the faint scrape of metal from the hinge. Then I saw a thin strip of yellow hallway light disappear beneath it. I locked the deadbolt, then pushed the small desk against the door. I told myself it was just caution, the kind you justify easily when you travel alone often enough. I sat back down and finished enough work to make leaving early the next morning practical, though I retained very little of what I read after that. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a car start somewhere near the end of the lot. I went to the window and pressed the curtain aside, just enough to look out. The glass was cold against my forehead. A dark gray sedan rolled away slowly, and for several seconds it moved without headlights. Then the lights came on near the road. Even from that distance, I could see one cracked rear tail light. At checkout the next morning, I asked the clerk in as casual a tone as I could manage whether they'd been busier overnight than expected. She looked at the register and said only 2 rooms had been occupied, mine and a construction worker in 205. I asked about 218. She frowned, then leaned down to check something beneath the counter. After a moment, she said that room had been out of service for months because of a plumbing problem and was supposed to remain locked until repairs were done. There was a faint smell of industrial cleaner in the office. Hanging from a hook behind the desk was a maintenance tag that read, in block letters, "Do not rent, 218. I drove away telling myself someone had probably used the empty room briefly for privacy or shelter, or some reason that would make sense if I knew more than I did. But that explanation has never been the part that stays with me. What stays with me is the timing. Whoever stood behind that door waited silently until I was almost past the opening. If I had continued toward the ice machine, I would have stepped within arm's reach of that blind corner. Even now, what I remember most clearly is the morning sunlight on the walkway and how close that machine was to room 218's door. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you want to hear the next account. Late March tends to be busy for my line of work. I'm 42, a commercial HVAC technician who travels across western Pennsylvania servicing older office buildings that haven't updated their systems in years. Most of my inspections are scheduled in the evenings, so the equipment can be tested without disrupting employees. One assignment took me to a small 3-story medical office building outside a rural town near Altoona. The property manager had left a key in a lockbox beside the glass entrance door and told me the building would be completely empty that night. When I stepped inside, the soft echo of my footsteps moved across the lobby floor in a way that reminded me just how quiet these buildings become after business hours. If you subscribe, you'll hear more accounts like this, ordinary work situations that turned quietly unsettling. My task that evening was straightforward. I needed to test the rooftop units and recalibrate several aging thermostat controls throughout the building. The inspection required moving floor by floor, checking airflow in offices and mechanical closets before documenting the readings. I expected the whole process to take maybe 2 hours before I drove to a motel nearby. The lobby lights stayed on overnight, but the hallways used motion sensors that activated only when someone walked through them. That meant large portions of the building would sit in darkness unless I was moving around. Overhead, the ventilation system produced a steady, low hum that carried through the ducts. One of my first stops would be the mechanical room labeled Unit B, Floor 3. I started on the 2nd floor, where several clinics had their offices. While checking the first thermostat, I noticed a nearby office door standing slightly open. The property manager had been clear that all interior rooms were supposed to remain locked after hours. It wasn't unusual for cleaning staff to forget one occasionally, so I pushed the door closed and continued working. As I moved farther down the corridor, the motion lights began shutting off behind me faster than expected. Fluorescent fixtures clicked off one section at a time, leaving the hallway dimmer with every few steps. I glanced back once at the thermostat display beside me. It read a steady 68 degrees. The work continued normally for a while. I moved from office to office, checking thermostats and vents, jotting down readings on my inspection sheet. But as I progressed through different hallways, I started noticing something odd. Several of the doors I had already closed were now open again, sometimes only an inch or two, but clearly not how I had left them. At first I blamed air pressure changes from the ventilation system cycling on and off. Older buildings can create strange drafts. Later, while I was on the third floor near the mechanical equipment, I heard a quiet thump somewhere below me. It sounded like something small falling onto a hard floor. I paused and listened, but the building returned to complete silence. A few minutes later, while adjusting an airflow vent, I noticed a hallway light on the second floor illuminate through the stairwell window, even though I was upstairs. My phone timer read 9:46 p.m. Air moved steadily through the metal ducts above the ceiling. If you appreciate slow burn, realistic horror, leave a like. Standing there reviewing my checklist, I realized the doors that reopened weren't in the same corridor. They were scattered across different areas of the building. Even with pressure changes, it didn't make sense that doors in separate wings would open at different times. The same thought occurred when I remembered the hallway light switching on while I was upstairs. Motion sensors respond only to movement nearby. I started to notice a pattern forming in my mind. Lights turning on where I wasn't, doors moving after I had left them closed. For the first time that evening, I considered the possibility that someone else might be inside the building. Just then I heard the faint creak of a stairwell door closing somewhere below, near the metal door marked Exit C. At that point I decided it would be best to finish the remaining checks quickly and leave. I packed a few of my tools and walked toward the nearest stairwell on the third floor. The hallway was quiet except for the distant airflow moving through the ducts. As I pushed open the stairwell door and started down, I heard something that stopped me immediately. Footsteps. Slow ones. They were coming upward from the second floor landing below me. I froze halfway down the stairs. The footsteps stopped at the exact same moment. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The building was silent except for the faint hum of ventilation somewhere behind the walls. Then the steps resumed, very slowly, like someone testing each stair before shifting their weight. I stepped backward without making noise and returned to the third floor landing. I waited there, listening carefully. After a moment, the footsteps continued upward. They reached the point on the stairs where I had been standing seconds earlier. The door leading from the stairwell into the third floor hallway moved slightly. It opened just enough to create a narrow gap, but it stopped before revealing whoever was behind it. I didn't wait for it to open further. Instead, I walked quietly down the hallway to the opposite stairwell and left the building through the rear exit beneath the red exit sign. Behind me I heard a faint rubber squeak from a shoe shifting on a stair step. Outside, I sat in my truck for several minutes, trying to decide what the responsible thing to do would be. The night air was cold and carried dust across the empty parking lot. Eventually I called the property manager and told him someone might still be inside the building. He suggested contacting the local police, which I did. While waiting, I watched the front entrance from across the lot. The glass doors never opened, and no one came outside. About 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled in, and an officer went inside to check the floors. I looked down at the dashboard clock while I waited. It read 10:18 p.m. The officer returned after a full walkthrough and said the building appeared empty. All stairwell doors were closed when he checked them, and none of the offices showed signs of forced entry or disturbance. We walked inside together briefly, so I could collect my tools. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My inspection clipboard still rested on desk 3B in one of the offices. Outside again, the patrol lights flashed red and blue against the dark windows of the building. The officer eventually drove away, leaving the property silent once more. I returned the following morning with another technician and finished the inspection in daylight. The building felt completely ordinary then, busy, clinical, and full of normal daytime sounds. But during the drive home, one detail kept repeating in my mind. Whoever had been on those stairs moved only when I moved, and stopped every time I did. I counted the steps later out of curiosity. There were 14 between the second and third floors. I can still hear the hollow echo they made inside that concrete stairwell. If this account stayed with you the way it stayed with me, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. Mid-September is one of the quieter parts of my work season. I'm 43, and I work as a freelance survey photographer documenting rural properties for a mapping company that updates land records and access routes. Most days I drive long stretches of county road, stopping briefly to photograph driveways, gates, or structures from public land before moving on to the next location. The work is repetitive but calm, and I usually prefer assignments far from towns where traffic is minimal. That afternoon I was mapping properties along a wooded stretch of highway in southern Missouri. A steady wind pushed dry leaves across the asphalt near County Road marker E17, the kind of quiet roadside movement you stop noticing after a while. If you subscribe, you'll hear more realistic accounts like this one. The company had recently updated several rural boundary records and needed fresh reference photographs of the access points along that road. My process was simple. I would pull over at each marked coordinate, step out, take a few quick photos of the driveway entrance or mailbox, then log the images before driving to the next property. The area was mostly farmland, with long gravel driveways disappearing into wooded lots where houses sat far back from the road. Sometimes you could see a barn roof through the trees, but most structures were hidden by distance and foliage. My GPS tablet rested on the passenger seat, displaying the next target, property ID 4472B. Outside, insects buzzed faintly in the late afternoon heat. When I reached that property entrance, the first thing I noticed was the mailbox. It was mounted unusually high on a tall wooden post, painted a dark green that stood out against the pale dust of the road. The driveway beside it stretched straight into the trees, but looked narrower than most rural drives in the area, almost like a path widened just enough for a vehicle. I took the standard reference photo from the shoulder and returned to my car. While reviewing the image on the camera screen, something about the tree line near the driveway entrance caught my attention. Across the road, dry cornfields rustled steadily in the wind. I continued down the road and photographed 2 more properties before curiosity made me scroll back through the earlier images. Looking closely at the photo from 4472B, I noticed something in the background that I hadn't seen while standing there. Far down the driveway, partially obscured by shadow, a figure appeared to be standing near the trees. At first I assumed it was just a shape formed by branches and shade. The person was distant enough that I had mistaken them for part of the landscape. Curious, I turned the truck around and drove back toward the driveway entrance to retake the photograph. The scene looked exactly the same as before. The mailbox, the gravel path, the woods. But the figure was no longer visible anywhere along the drive. While framing another photo, I noticed something else. Faint tire tracks veering away from the driveway into the woods rather than continuing toward the house. The camera shutter clicked quietly as the timestamp recorded 4:12 p.m. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, leave a like. Back in the truck, I enlarged the earlier photograph. At 200% zoom, the figure became slightly clearer. What stood out wasn't their presence, but their posture. They weren't facing the road where I had been parked. They were turned sideways, their attention directed deeper into the woods behind the driveway. That direction didn't lead toward the house at all. Instead, it pointed toward a narrow dirt path that barely showed through the trees beyond the gravel. As I studied the image, the wind outside suddenly dropped off, leaving the roadside strangely quiet. I decided to step a few feet up the driveway to take one more photo from a better angle. It would only take a moment, and technically I was still on the access point near the road. Gravel shifted softly under my shoes as I raised the camera. Just as I adjusted the lens, I heard a faint snapping sound somewhere deeper in the woods. It sounded like a small branch breaking. I lowered the camera slightly and listened. The trees were still, and I couldn't see any movement beyond the driveway. From that angle, I could see the narrow dirt path more clearly now. Leaves along it looked pressed flat, forming a thin line that disappeared between the trunks. It gave the impression of recent use, though I couldn't say when. I lifted the camera again and pointed the lens toward the path. Before I could take the shot, another snapping sound came from much closer, close enough that I instinctively turned around. The noise had come from behind me, somewhere near the road. The dark green mailbox was moving. Not swinging in the wind, there was no wind anymore, but swaying slowly on its post. As I watched, the wood gave a quiet creak. I walked back to the truck without taking another photograph. The odometer read 63,118 miles as I started the engine. I drove several miles before pulling over at a gravel turnout to review the photographs again. The air conditioner hummed steadily inside the cab while I scrolled through the images. The figure from the earlier shot was still there in the background, small and indistinct but unmistakably human in shape. I considered deleting the photo for a moment, mostly because something about it felt wrong to keep. In the end, I left it in the file like any other property record. I finished the rest of the assignments along that road without anything unusual happening, though I noticed myself checking the mirrors more often than usual. Later that evening, in a small motel room outside town, I opened the photo on my laptop and enlarged it further. The laptop fan spun quietly as the image sharpened on the screen. At 400% zoom, the figure became a little clearer, though still distant enough that details were difficult to distinguish. The person stood only a few feet away from the dirt path leading into the woods. Their shoulders were angled toward it, as if watching something beyond the trees. What unsettled me wasn't the figure itself. It was the direction of their attention. The person in the photograph wasn't watching the road or the driveway where I had been standing. They were looking down that narrow path, disappearing into the woods behind them. The path led somewhere my camera couldn't capture beyond the tree line. The longer I stared at the image, the more it seemed like the person wasn't waiting for someone arriving from the road. They were watching something deeper in the forest. The motel room stayed dark except for the glow of the laptop screen and the frozen timestamp at the corner of the photograph, for 12 p.m. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you want to hear the next account.